Hello, this is Lynn McCool. In this screencast, we will consider communication models using the CMAP method. What is communication modeling? Communication modeling is used to explain the way people exchange information. Think of it as a way to describe or illustrate communication more broadly, of allowing technical communication writers to determine the best approach for each project. There are different kinds of communication models. The two that we'll look at here today are called the transaction model of communication and the CMAP model. Some terms to know about the transaction model of communication. We'll start with this one first, as it's an older model. We have the word source, which is used in the transaction model. Source is, in this kind of model of communication, a person who creates and sends a message to receivers. The message is a set of verbal or nonverbal ideas that a source conveys through the communication process. To encode means to choose a verbal or nonverbal set of symbols to organize and deliver one's message. And to decode is to interpret a message by making sense of a source's verbal and nonverbal symbols. So the source does the encoding, however, decoding is performed by a receiver. Verbal symbols can be spoken, written, or recorded words that a source uses to convey a message. Nonverbal symbols also are a means of communication, but we do it without words, and those could include things like gestures, facial expressions, eye contact, and images. Receivers, of course, are the ones who possess the message or receive it in, and then it's their job to perceive its meaning or decode it. This whole process is known as a transaction. In other words, a communication exchange in which all participants continuously send and receive messages to each other. One additional term is the term feedback. Feedback is the message or the information that an audience's verbal and nonverbal responses are sent to a source's message. Okay, so let's take a look at a simple transaction model. Here on the left, we see Sarah. She's the sender, and she encodes a message that she wants to send to Ted, who is the receiver. Ted receives that message, he interprets or decodes the message, and then Ted decides to provide some feedback to Sarah. He sends the feedback to Sarah, she processes that feedback and modifies her response, and then begins all over again by encoding a message to send to Ted. And so it's this back and forth exchange of the simple transaction model. However, we know we don't live in a perfect world, and so not all transactions between two people are expertly sent and also expertly decoded. And so we know that there is something called noise or interference that can disrupt the communication transaction. So noise or interference are those external or internal phenomena that can disrupt communication. So for example, external sources could include a physical loud noise, or if you were actually talking face-to-face with someone, perhaps it's the temperature of a room or the lack of lighting or any other kind of physical element that might disrupt communication. Internal sources might include anything that's within either the sender or the receiver, and that could include wandering thoughts or perhaps some sort of physical pain or something inside the person that is disrupting the ability to either send or accurately receive communication. Okay, so here's an example of that interference transaction model. So this is a slight variation on the transaction model. On the left, we see Sarah. Again, she's the sender, and she wants to send a message to Ted, the receiver, but she's having trouble because there is noise in the transaction. And remember, that noise could be any kind of either external or internal disruption. So therefore, Ted does not fully receive the message because it's distorted. So Sarah encodes the message a second time and tries again. However, because of noise, miscommunication occurs. Ted gives some feedback to Sarah, she tries again, and so forth. And the back and forth process then continues to happen, but not as effectively as in that first simple transaction model. And probably the interference transaction model is more accurate to describe exactly what happens, because we do have those internal and external disruptions that complicate communication. Obviously, within the simple transaction and even the interference transaction models, there is a desire for something called shared meaning. In other words, a common understanding with little confusion and few misinterpretations. But neither one of those models are very good at explaining how a writer can achieve shared meaning. They just merely highlight that there is a communication exchange going back and forth, and that sometimes there can be problems within that exchange. So even though it doesn't describe how to achieve shared meaning, that is one of the priorities in a transactional model of communication. Okay, so here's another visual to try to explain that interference transaction model. Again, you have your speaker, also known as the source, who encodes a message. A message is sent over to the audience or the receiver, and the audience decodes that, or the receiver decodes it. That message, though, may be disrupted by noise. It may or may not, depending upon the context and the situation, but it may be disrupted by noise. The goal of that transaction is shared meaning. In other words, what the source or the speaker intended for the audience or the receiver to understand, the audience or receiver does understand. And then the audience or the receiver then turns around and becomes a source themselves and encodes some feedback, which is a specific kind of message, back to the speaker, who has the role of decoding that. And you can see it continues to go in a loop like that. Before we go on to the CMAP model of communication, I want to spend just a minute or two talking about the rhetorical situation. The rhetorical situation establishes relationships among the writer, audience, and message. What is a rhetorical situation? Well, a rhetorical situation is the context in which you are interpreting or composing a piece of written, verbal, or visual communication. When purposeful language can resolve the exigence, we say that the situation is rhetorical. In order to fulfill the purpose, the writer must adapt the message to the intended audience. Here's a diagram of how the rhetorical situation might work. Out here, we see that we have some sort of exigence, or the situation or problem that causes the speaker or the writer to create a message. The speaker or writer in a rhetorical situation is the person who identifies the exigence. Again, the exigence is the reason or problem that compels that person to write in the first place. The subject or the message is the information delivered through visual, written, or verbal means. The audience is the reader or readers who have the capability of resolving the exigence or problem. And the context are the constraints, such as obstacles, and resources, such as positive influences in the environment surrounding the rhetorical situation. Context can be comprised of elements such as time and place, speaker and audience, medium of delivery, circumstances under which the speaker and reader communicate, social, political, religious, and other cultural factors, as well as constraints and resources of that particular rhetorical situation. Finally, the purpose for the whole rhetorical situation is to find resolution to the exigence, or sometimes this is known as the rhetorical problem. Therefore, how and what you communicate is always influenced, either positively or negatively, by context. And the rhetorical situation then plays a big part in the communication model that I'm going to talk about next. The CMAP model communication is comprised of context, message, audience, purpose, and product. The context is the situations in which people find themselves, and those situations affect their communication. What people say is the message, and the message is affected by the person or group with whom they are communicating which is the audience. What people communicate is affected by their reason for communicating and their expectations. This is the purpose for writing. And finally, the physical form of the communication is the product, and that affects the way in which the communication is formulated and received. Here's a model of the communication, CMAP communication diagram. So here we have the message, the audience, purpose, and the product. And we can see that each one of these elements is interacting with the other. So the message affects the audience to which the communication is directed. The purpose affects the intent of the message. The product refers to the technical document. And each one of these elements impacts and affects others continuously. So all of these ideas affect each other all the time. And the first step to creating effective technical communication is to conduct a CMAP analysis, which is more inclusive than just a strict audience analysis. Let's consider this scenario for a moment. Let's take Sarah here, for example. Let's say that she works at a company called Clean Water USA, and Clean Water has been asked to conduct a series of tests on an aquifer in this area, because this particular city has had a high incidence of waterborne illness. Sarah, as one of the researchers, tests the water. She uses best practices and industry standard equipment, and when the research is done, it's time for her to write up the results of her research, to make a recommendation to fix the problem of poor water quality, and share this recommendation with the city municipal works engineer, the city planners, and the public at large. So you can see that now she has a reason for writing an exigence. There's been waterborne illness, she's done research, she's collected data, and she wants to get that message out to an audience. Notice that her audience is multi-layered. In other words, it's not just going to one person, but to several different kinds of people, several different stakeholders is the word that we use, and that she has to produce a product. In other words, she has to create a report to showcase the information that she has learned. So in this scenario, the audience is comprised of several different groups. We have the city municipal waterworks engineer, the city planners, and then the public at large. What we would want to consider in our CMAP analysis is where would each of these fit into that audience analysis diagram of primary, secondary, tertiary, or gatekeeper kinds of readers. And also, what each level of reader would bring to that document. What would be their needs, their values, and their attitudes. As far as the message is concerned, we would want to consider the context and the situation that surrounds this message that Sarah wants to craft and send out. If the research shows that water quality is seriously compromised, then the message will have an air of urgency about it. If it shows that the water quality is actually good, then the message will want to be received in a timely manner, but it will not have the same level of urgency as if the water quality was poor. So the message should briefly discuss available solutions to the problem while clearly recommending a superior way to solve the problem, whatever it might be. The purpose for the communication would be to recommend one solution as better over a series of several other solutions. And maybe it's better, maybe this particular solution is more feasible or more cost-effective, whatever the particular angle is, but one solution recommended over others. The product, of course, would be a specific kind of genre of communication, which would be the recommendation report, and that genre has some specific elements to it, like the introduction section, the discussion section, and a conclusion section, and each one of these sections have specific moves or specific elements that comprise that section, as well as some additional sections beyond the conclusion, like a contact information section, a documentation section where sources and references would be placed, as well as an appendix or a set of appendices where Sarah could include additional information or materials that would be interesting and needed for augmenting the report, but not necessary for actually understanding the report. So often tables and graphs are found in the appendices. So that brings me to the end of this screencast, in which I'm going to ask you to conduct your own CMAP analysis